Hey, Naomi Wilson here from Focus HR. Look, we keep hearing that trying to deal with how to treat COVID-19 leave-related issues is just too confusing, and we hear you. The wording on the Fair Work website is really ambiguous, and the guidelines just keep on changing. So we've been doing a bunch of reading. We've explored all the different options and the different scenarios we can think of, and we've tried to pull those together into a bit of a simple 10-minute explainer. Please keep in mind that the legislation is constantly changing, and that's part of what's making it so difficult for businesses to keep up. So the information I'm covering at the moment is what we know to be current as at the 12th of January 2022. But beyond that, I really, as situations change, we really can't promise that this stays current. I also have to stress that for every company, their awards, their enterprise agreements, their policies, their contracts of employment, all of those sorts of things can all impact quite heavily on what the entitlements are around leave. So keep that in mind. And if you need some specific guidance around your situation, please give us a call. We've also included some helpful links at the end of the video, but in the meantime, I've actually put together a little PowerPoint just to sort of help to give you a bit of a visual on the decision-making process. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see that with me. All right. So we started off by thinking, what are the main reasons someone is going to need leave that is COVID related? And we saw 5 main reasons, and the leave that then applies would change according to what the reason is. Bear with me, I'm going to try to go through it quite logically. My other quick note before I keep going is that what I'm covering actually applies to permanent full-time and part-time employees who have leave accrued. So if an employee is a casual, they're not entitled to paid leave. And if a full-time or a part-time person has exhausted their accrued leave entitlement, then it becomes unpaid as well. So our 5 reasons for people taking leave could be they're instructed to quarantine because they're a close contact. They're required to isolate due to a positive test result. They're displaying symptoms, so it's a personal choice that they're going to stay home because they're unwell. They may be instructed by the employer, or it might be as a carer for a family or household member. So if we tackle the first one, if the person is instructed to quarantine as a close contact, keep in mind with this, the close contact for this purpose has been defined as a person who is a household member or a household-like contact of a diagnosed person. And that household-like contact, in a nutshell, is a person who spent more than 4 hours with the diagnosed person in a house or other place of accommodation. And there's a few exemptions around that, but that's it in a nutshell. So currently, a close contact doesn't need to do a COVID test unless they're displaying symptoms. But they do need to have a test on day 6 of their isolation and have a negative test result before they can return to work, return out of quarantine. And so in this situation, in terms of leave from the workplace, the way that we see it is, if the person goes into quarantine and they are displaying symptoms, so they're actually unwell and therefore shouldn't be at work due to personal leave, then they would be entitled to paid personal leave, and you'd apply your normal reasonable evidence requirements for that situation. If they're not actually displaying any symptoms, it's just that they've been told that they have to quarantine, then it's actually unpaid leave until they get the test results. Now, when they get the test results, whether that's early in the quarantine period or after day 6, if they have a negative test result, then they remain on unpaid leave until they return to work. If they get a positive test result, then paid personal leave starts to apply from that date because they're absent from work because they're unfit to attend due to an illness. And so that paid personal leave starts from the date of the positive test and would obviously continue for the isolation period, which we're going to cover. That's scenario number 2, which is they are absent from work because they have to isolate because of a positive test result. Now, this one really is quite simple. It doesn't matter whether they're symptomatic or not. If they have a positive test result, it means that they are unwell, they are carrying an illness, and they're unable to attend work. So it means that they're entitled to paid personal leave until they return. Now, at the moment, it's a 7-day isolation period with 48 hours of no symptoms other than a mild cough that's not getting worse. That's sort of the rule of thumb around when they can return to work. Again, you can apply your normal evidence requirements around reasonable medical evidence of the need for leave before you actually pay that leave. And it's really important that your leave policies actually specify what you expect from people in that setting. So our third scenario is where they are displaying symptoms. So it's a personal situation. They've not been instructed to remain home as a close contact, but they're feeling unwell and therefore decide to stay home. Now, interestingly, when someone isn't identified as a close contact, there's no requirement for them to do a COVID test if they've got symptoms or quarantine for a certain period of time. Of course, it's encouraged, but it's not a requirement. And this is where your policies become really important. So, the way that we see best practice is firstly, if someone's genuinely unwell, they're naturally entitled to take paid leave. Again, apply your normal policy in relation to your evidence requirements for that. From there, they might simply return to work when they're well enough. If they're tested, you need to wait for those test results to come through before they can return to work. So obviously, if it's a negative result, they return to work when they're feeling better. If the result is a positive test result and they're defined as having COVID, then they move into that need to have the 7-day isolation and they're entitled to paid personal leave for that period. The fourth scenario is where an employer instructs an employee to have a test. So there are a lot of businesses out there that have policies in place and reasonable grounds under which they may direct an employee to have a test. And that can be a reasonable management direction under work health and safety laws. So if the employer requires the employee to test, but it's not required under a public health order, then the employee is entitled to be tested on paid work time and to also be paid for the absence while they're waiting on results. And that's not actually personal leave, it's just paid time. So from there, you need to wait for the test results before they return to work. If the results are negative, and if the person's feeling better, if that was your reason for getting them to test, then they can return to work. If the result comes back as a positive test result, then again, paid personal leave starts and continues for that isolation period until they're well enough to return to work. And again, you're allowed to request the reasonable medical evidence to show that. And our final scenario is carer's leave. So it might not actually be your employee who's exhibiting symptoms or who's required to quarantine, but a member of their household or family might need to do that. Now, keep in mind, if a member of their household has to quarantine or isolate rather as a positive COVID case, then there's every chance your employee has to quarantine, which we've already covered. But that aside, the rules that we see applying are if an employee has a child who is, typically that school-aged or younger child, and that child is required to quarantine or isolate, then the individual, the employee, is entitled to take paid personal leave as carer's leave because they genuinely need to care for that child. If the employee's household or family member is an adult and doesn't actually require care. So the next question is, if they're an adult, do they actually require care? Are they unwell, or have they just been told they have to be at home because they've got a quarantine as a close contact? So if they don't actually require care, then there is no entitlement to paid leave. In fact, you wouldn't even argue there's an entitlement to unpaid leave unless there was actually a directive on them to stay at home. If the member of the family or household is actually unwell and requires care, then again, your normal paid personal leave entitlements apply as a carer, just like it normally would if you had to stay home to take care of a husband or a sister or those sorts of things. Couple of other key points that we just want to make sure we cover so that it's not purely about what are the leave entitlements. The first one is working from home options. So we recommend we always have applying consideration to whether an employee can actually work from home. So at the moment, for the health of the workforce, if someone's got even mild symptoms, we normally don't want them to come to work so that no one else gets sick. And that's different to what it used to be, where people would come to work even if they were a little bit under the weather because they were still fully capable of working. So that circumstance of an employee being absent because they've got mild symptoms, but realistically being quite capable of doing work is really likely to occur. So if you've got that working from home plan and policy in place, It allows the employer to perform productive work for you. It means that they're not using up personal leave or being on unpaid leave. And the business obviously continues to benefit from their contributions as well. Having clear policies on leave and on working from home are really essential in this setting, more important now than ever. One of the other points is that a lot of awards, there's about 74 modern awards that have this thing called a Schedule X, and it allows for 2 weeks unpaid pandemic leave, and annual leave at half pay. When we're looking at pandemic leave, it's unpaid leave. Really, the only difference that this schedule makes to those employees covered under the award is that pandemic leave actually counts as service towards the accrual of entitlements under the award and the NES, where normally unpaid leave doesn't count towards that. Some employees may also be entitled to pandemic leave disaster payment. Um, there's guidelines around that. There's also different guidelines in place for quarantining and isolation if an employer is defined as a critical industry and the employees are critically essential workers. And we're going to give you links at the end of this video that'll help you to get more information on that. But please feel free to contact us as well if you need some additional guidance on that. And just keep in mind too that what I've just covered is the minimum entitlement. So as an employer, you can always decide to allow for more generous provisions around personal leave, allowing them to utilise annual leave rather than being on leave without pay, those sorts of things. This is just what we understand to be the minimum requirements. And one last really important message, I think through all of this, we have to remember that we're dealing with people. So all of us, employers and employees alike, are facing a really uncertain time. We're likely to be experiencing anything from frustration to anger to sadness to fear. And how we handle these difficult times as leaders is going to leave a lasting impression on our people and our relationships with our people. And our intent at Focus HR is certainly to always navigate every situation with the right intent to keep the relationship strong. So if you need to check in with us about your scenario or what the best approach is for your business, or you need help with a policy or anything like that, please just reach out to us. We'll help you if we can, or we'll put you in the right direction otherwise. And with that, I'll leave you with a slide which shows the useful sites that I've used in putting this together in terms of all the different elements. So feel free to go on those and have a bit of a read, and thank you for listening.